Okay, good morning, everybody. It's Peter here from AJS, and it's my delight to welcome back to the other side of the screen is Chris. We've got some exciting little tips to share with our viewers this morning, and it's all around soldering findings. Do you want to elaborate on what we're going to get up to today?
Thank you, Peter. Welcome, everybody. Yeah, this morning we're going to talk about little tips that'll save you a lot of heartache with soldering findings onto brooches, putting your posts onto earrings, little earrings, how to put the posts on successfully, strongly, and do a pair of cufflinks. Add the findings to them and solder them on, and yeah.
And what particular tools are we going to be using, Chris?
Well, we're just be using a little bit of drilling, mainly soldering. So we've got Peter's got the soldering mat set up ready to go, and binding wire, and just application of solder and flux, and just showing people how to put very small findings onto the back of a brooch, or how to actually solder your pins safely onto your earrings. So it's really just soldering technique.
So you're saying there's a fine line between securing your object and actually stuffing it. So
Yep.
yeah, you've got a few little tips that you've picked up along the way that you can share to make life easier for everybody.
Absolutely, yeah. I've sort of learned a lot over the years. I can remember being a lot younger and making the odd brooch and the odd pair of earrings and melting all my findings and squeezing things with the tweezers and wondering what was going wrong and thinking it was definitely all about me. But yeah, I do production work for a private school in Geelong, and I've learnt over the last 25 years how to do multiple applications of things, and I think if I can pass that knowledge on to the good people watching us, then they'll feel a bit more confident.
No, that's great. Very giving of you. Really appreciate it. So what item are we going to start with, Chris?
Well, I might start with the very basics of soldering a pin onto just a disc earring. So I prepared a few things last night. I made this. These are little texture discs. They're just a disc cut out on a disc cutter. Got a nice little AJS disc cutter. I've got two pairs here, but I'm just going to do the one. And we're going to solder the pin onto the back of that on the soldering mat. And it's not easy to solder a 1mm wire onto the back of something without melting the wire or having a poor solder joint. So here's a few tips how to do that. So I've got my little disc, and remember our last lesson, we actually did the quality marking. I've actually marked the disc already. It's just a basic little disc, which I've domed up in my doming block. Probably going to knock the camera here because I've got to do a bit of drilling. So the first thing I'm going to do is mark the back of the disc, and we're going to pre-drill so that the wire, which we're going to solder to the disc, actually fits into a little divot shape in the disc. And that's going to give you a very secure solder joint. So I'm going to take my little disc, get my little indelible pen, and mark the very center where I want to pre-drill. And I'm using a 1mm wire to attach as the pin, and I'm going to drill just carefully 0.5mm in to that disc. I don't want to drill all the way through, otherwise the pin will come to the front. So I pre-drilled a little hole right in the middle of the disc, and I'm now using a very small little 1.5mm ball burr with my fingers, putting that into the hole and taking the burr off that hole. So I'm actually rounding the hole up and making it a bit easier for the wire to go in there. Now I've pre-cut some wire, very, very, very small lengths of wire. They're about 15mm long, 1mm thick wire. And after you cut your wire off, you need to either use a very fine needle file to round up the wire so it's a little hemisphere on the end, or you could use a cut burr. Again, I've got a great selection of burrs from AJS. I've got a little cut burr which can go into your flexi drive. Take that out. Put the little cup burr on. So the cup burr is literally a cup, and when the wire goes in and the cup turns, it grinds into the wire into a lovely half round shape. So I grab that piece of wire, put the cup over the end of the wire, just roll that around, and I've got a perfectly shaped little piece of wire, which, if I'm lucky, might just sit in there on its own. No, it wants to stick onto my finger. That's okay. Yep, it's not going to sit in there, but that wire does go into that little spot at the back of my earring. So I'm now going to come over to my soldering mat, and we're going to prepare this for soldering. So I'll just hold that up. Maybe you can see that. There's a little disc, and there's a little, you can just see the shiny little divot where I've drilled. Tiny little drill hole there.
Yeah, we've got a great view of that, Chris.
I'll hold that up in a second. I'll just show you where that wire goes. And that wire will go right into that little divot. I'll get my fingers out of the way. And that's going to lock in there, a little bit hard to see, like that will just lock in beautifully into that shape. Now, there's a reason why you do pre-drill rather than just sit the wire on. If you sit the wire on and try to solder it, the first thing will happen is the solder will go everywhere and the wire will not be in the center. But by having that little pre-drill shape, you're encouraging the wire to go straight into the divot. And the other thing I'm going to do is put my solder into that divot. So I'm just, you might see a little green flame in a second. That'll be my methylated spirits burning away. Might be a bit too much light.
No, we can see
turn
it.
the light off for a second. And that might help a little bit. Just going to set up my flame. Preheat that and add a little bit of flux down into that divot shape. And I'm going to add a little bit of flux to the end of my wire. Just the last 2 to 3 mils of the wire is fluxed. So I now have flux on my wire and I've got flux on my earring. And I've prepared a little bit of solder. So these are very fine pieces of solder. You don't want solder going everywhere because I have actually quality marked the back of these earrings. I want that to be not filled with solder. Going to heat up the disc a little bit. And I'm placing the solder right into that little divot. So the solder is right in the center of the earring, ready to solder. Pick up my little wire in the tweezers, ready to put on, because this all has to be done by hand. Slowly heat up my disc. And because that solder is right in the center, in the little groove that I drilled, it just sinks in, it's just sunk in. And I can now place my wire on the top. Reheat the disc very gently. Don't put any heat on the wire. And there it goes. It's soldered perfectly into the disc.
Well done.
Right in the center, nice and vertical. And because of that little pre-drill shape. If that wire was a little bit off angle, it's a little bit off angle that way, I might just reheat that again a fraction. Just gently hold it on the mat, redirect the heat. Hold your hands very steady till it freezes, till the solder freezes over. And yeah, I'm very, very happy with that. So I'm going to cool that off in the water. Pop that into my pickle pot. Now I'm going to show you the one I did earlier. So this is the one I made earlier. It's been pickled. The wire is nicely in the center there. Very strong solder joint because the solder is all the way underneath the wire, hasn't climbed up the wire because I put all the heat into the disc. And that's ready now to harden. So to harden this, I'm going to grab a pair of parallel pliers. And because my actual length of wire is longer than I need it when I'm finished, I'm going to grab the last 2 millimeters of wire. In fact, I'll show you this. I should be able to show you this. So, of course, soldering the wire in there, I've annealed the wire. So I've softened it. I'm just drawing a little black texture line down the wire. Just see if we can pick that up. Yeah, you can just see that little black line, I think, on the wire. Maybe. It's a bit shiny, a bit hard to see.
You're just struggling a bit.
Yeah, it's just very small. So I'm going to grab the last 2 millimeters of the wire with the parallel pliers. I'm going to hold the disc carefully. And this will test my solder joint because by spinning the wire with the parallels, I'm going to help harden the wire by working the material so it won't just bend over in someone's ear. So I'm going to grab that, turn the pliers, 1, 2, 3, 4. Wow, I can feel this, the tension coming on to that wire as you spin it. Just gently straighten the wire. Straighten that a little bit more. And then if I actually, probably hard to see, but I've actually now got a little barley twist of a black line on that wire. In fact, you can just see it there. There's a little black twist on the wire. Yeah,
we can see that. Yep.
And that means I've actually spiraled the wire by just gently turning it on itself. And if your solder joint has any real integrity, it'll hold up to that, and suddenly your wire has got a lot more tension to it. I can pull on it without it bending over, and that's really important. So that's the first thing you learn about soldering a wire on and creating some tension and doing a really neat solder joint at the bottom, so you haven't done any damage.
Well, it certainly gives you trust in your solder joint, because if it wasn't connected properly, it'd just twist off, wouldn't it?
This is absolutely the case, yeah. If that twists off, I've got to do it again, but it does mean you've got integrity in your joint, and it means you've created tension, which you didn't have before, because after soldering, you've lost all of that tension, and you need to get it back in there. And that's part of the thing of jewellery, is you want to give your clients something that's strong and robust. But yeah, you've definitely tested your wire. So to finish that off, I would mark my earrings around about 10 millimeters long. 10 and a half is about the maximum length on a post. Mark that. I get my end cutters, cut off the last 2 to 3 millimeters. So I've now made that a lot smaller. Go back to my little cupping burr. Soften the end of the wire off because you don't want to jag client's ear. Round it up, or you could do this with a little escapement file. Perhaps it's round it up nicely with a cut burr. I'll just put a bit of 1500 over that, just to round that a fraction more. And that's nice and soft to go through the earring, through the ear. So one last thing to do on an earring post. So I've got my little butterfly fitting here, which should go onto that wire. In fact, I'll probably have to drill that because commercially, oh no, it goes straight on. So now, if I hold that up, you can see the little butterfly goes onto the post. Now, what I need in my post is a little groove for the little wings of the butterfly to go into to lock in, so that the butterfly doesn't fly off the back of the post. So I'm going to come back with my texture pen and about 2 millimeters, 1.5 to 2 mils from the end of the wire. It's probably about 1.5 millimeters. I make a little black line. I grab my end. These are just all little tips. I get my little end cutters and I put them on that black line, just gently, very gentle squeeze because I don't want to snip it off. And I rotate that earring in the end cutter just under very gentle pressure, one rotation. And it's created a really lovely sharp groove in the wire. It's probably a bit hard for you to see, but there is a little groove in the wire, and I'm going to now broaden that groove out, and that will give me the groove that my butterfly fits into. Again, I've got some fantastic files from AJS. These are lovely escapement files. This is a little rat tail escapement. It's tiny, and that's going to fit into that little groove that I cut, and I'm going to go back to the peg and I'm going to just roll that groove out a little bit wider and a bit deeper. You can also do this with a saw frame. Just going to rotate this. It's really worth having a lovely set of escapements. Escapement files are the files smaller than your needle files, and they really do give you a super fine finish. And almost all the way around. A little bit further. And just a tiny bit more. So you can do this various ways. You can do it with the saw frame. So once you've got that little groove that you've popped in with the end cutters, you can also use a frame and push the frame backwards rather than cutting. So usually we're cutting down. I'm actually just pushing against the blade. And in that pushing sequence, it does remove a little bit of metal. And it gives you obviously a groove as wide as your saw blade. And that's fine. I've now got a super fine groove in the back of that post. See if I can find my butterfly. Here it is. I can now put the butterfly on to that post. And if I slide all the way down and then bring it back up, it locks into that little groove. The little twirls on the butterfly lock in onto the post so that the client can't lose it. So just a couple of little tips there on how to pre-drill the back of your earring, place your wire, roll your wire around, make sure you put your solder in first, bring your wire down and then heat the earring. So don't heat the wire. The heat coming through with the torch onto the disc or the back of the earring will actually pull the solder into the earring, but up into the wire very quickly, because this is all about the movement of heat through your metal. If you try to put the solder on your wire and place your wire down, the solder will run up your wire, you'll burn the wire will disintegrate, and you'll have a big ball of metal. Put all of the heat into the earring, and when you place the wire down onto the solder, you'll find the heat will transfer almost instantly. You'll suddenly have results you've never had before. So there's your little earring, simple little tips, very strong join, hardened wire, and a nice little groove for the butterfly. So that one's done.
Great job, Chris. Now, I'll just take this opportunity just to ask people if they've got any questions, just to please fire away in the comments. But I do have a couple of little product questions for you. One, yeah, was that tenacity you were using as the flux there?
It is tenacity, yeah. It's actually in an old container, but it is tenacity. The tenacity 4A is absolutely fantastic.
Beautiful.
I
And
highly recommend it.
the question was asked, does AJS sell escapement files?
They do indeed.
There you go.
So just give an idea. I've got a whole selection of escapements, all the different shapes. You know, here are your needle files, the big bad ones, and there are your escapement files. And they are finer and they give you absolute precision. So they're just fantastic to have. And you can buy pretty well all the regular shapes, triangular, knife edge, barrette, little wrap tails. I've got a whole selection of them. Just couldn't live without them. And you can get them in various cuts: second cut, third cut, fourth cut, etc. So they're great tools to have. All right, so moving on. Now what we're going to do is some cufflink backs. So these are cufflinks I make for a school in Geelong. And they're actually a cast component. I've got a master pattern to them, and what we're going to be doing is applying the little joint at the back and the little spring-loaded fittings. So these are the ones with little spring-loaded commercial findings, and they spin around. And when we solder the joint on, that cufflink is going to be able to bend on the rivet. So there's a little rivet goes through, which allows all this movement to go on in the cufflink as it moves with your arm. And that's a little spring-loaded fitting there, which spins around. So they do take quite a bit of punishment. And again, the only way to do this is to actually solder them on properly and get a good join. So I've pre-prepared mine, as you do. I've done some homework. So I've done my quality marking on the back. I've got my maker's mark on there, etc. That's the front of the cufflink. So it's got the name on the front. And we're going to be soldering our finding on the very back of the cufflink. So at the moment, it's just a flat disc, which we're going to have to put on a very small, where's a spare one? Here it is, here it's actually on the wire. So this little link, tiny little piece is going to be soldered on the back. And here it is on a piece of binding wire. So this is a very tiny fitting that's going to be soldered onto the back of that link. And again, for this to have that integrity that Peter was alluding to before, the strength of the soldering, I've got to do it properly. So a little bit of preparation goes into this. I'll show you one I've done earlier, which is finished. That just shows you the small little soldered piece on the back of the cufflink. It's just a little U shape, little joint. And my fitting is going to go in there. My spring-loaded fitting is going to fit into that joint. And it'll be riveted through to hold it together. So if I take that out, slide it out, I've got this tiny little joint to go in there. So to solder that with confidence, I have to be able to hold it with confidence. And one of the things that I like to do is not to hold the joint itself, is actually to bind it so I've got something to hold on to. So I'm going to hold this up for the camera. I know this is all very small stuff. If you look at this, if Peter can go onto the soldering camera,
Sorry.
I've got a little piece of binding wire holding that joint in place. You see the joint? It's actually very small. I know it's a bit blurred. I'll hold it back a bit. That tiny little silver thing on the end is being held by a little stick of binding wire. You can see that there. And I feed the binding wire through the hole in the joint. So I prepared a little bit of binding wire. I can get it as simple. I might just grab a little bit over here, do a single one. You only need about 20 millimeters of binding wire. Again, you should have a whole selection of this. AJS has a good selection of binding wire, sort of a 20 gauge or an 18 gauge. And I'm going to feed that through the hole in the joint. Gently fold it up. And then I'm going to get on there with a pair of pliers and twist the binding wire until I've got a nice little twisted end. So it goes through in a singular way and then becomes a twisted binding wire. A lot of people ask me about binding wire, you know, why do you twist it up, Chris? Why do you do all of that? It's all about tension. If you use nice fine binding wire that you tension by twisting, you've got tensile strength. It's a bit like when I go over the Westgate Bridge, Peter, and you look up at those cables that hold the bridge up. If all those cables were just a solid cable, the same thickness, the bridge would fall down. But because there are tens of thousands of little cables all twisted together, they're multiple times stronger. And this is the same in jewellery. You need binding wire to be twisted to have strength. Okay, so I've now got my little joint holding on the end of a piece of binding wire. I also take the joint, I know I'm telling you a lot here, and I actually file the back of that joint with a piece of emery so that the bottom is lovely and flat. A bit of 600 grit emery. One of the reasons I do this is because your findings are often silver plated. Commercially, they're silver plated to make them look snazzy when you buy them. But really, you don't want that silver plating on there when you're soldering. So it's a good idea just to emery that off. So I've got my joint prepared for soldering. And here's my cufflink back. So I'm going to pick up the back. I'm going to flambe it. So I keep because I'm working in silver here, so I'm going to keep the fire scale down. That's my little boric acid mix. And flambe that off. So with this technique, I mean, I know where I'm soldering this to. You might want to put a little cross on or something like that, but where you're going to put your solder. But you do need to know exactly where you're going to be soldering. Just adjust my flame to the size of the job. So that's big enough for this piece. And you can notice my flame's got a little bit of orange in it. I don't want one of those really hot flames. I want it just a little bit softer. Apply my tenacity to the back where I need it. Just preheat a little bit. I need it just in the center there. That's where my little joint is going to go. Okay, now, this is the big learning curve. I only want flux on the very bottom of my joint. I don't want flux all over it, because the solder will run up and fill all the grooves and fill all the holes. So you may notice I've turned my flux brush back to front. It's got flux on the end of it. I'm holding my little joint holding with the binding wire, because if I hold the joint like this with the tweezers, when it gets hot, I'll squeeze it and crush it. So by holding it with the binding wire, I've got much more control over it. I now put a little bit of heat on the joint, enough to bring it to about 200 degrees, and I touch it down on my flux brush. Heat it again, touch it down again, and I've now got flux just on the bottom of the joint. It's not all over the joint. It's only on the very, very bottom where I want the solder to go. Now I'm going to pick up my solder, heat the cuff link up. I'll just move my hand in a second. Place my solder down right in the center of the cuff link. And I'm going to preheat that till the solder just starts to run, then I'm going to stop. I've got a little blob of solder there now. Pick up my finding. Just going to adjust that in my tweezers. And I'm holding, again, the binding wire again. Occasionally I forget, and I pick this up, Peter, when the joint is hot.
Yeah, you wouldn't want to do that too many times.
You got to be careful. So this might be a little bit. I'll just see how I go with positioning this, so you can maybe see what happens. And I'm now putting my hand where it's safe. Probably a little bit hard for you to see. Okay, that might be a bit better. I'm putting my hand so that I can lift the joint up and down and bring it into position when I'm ready. So it's just a movement of bringing it down when I'm ready to solder. I reheat the base piece with the solder on it. And the reason I'm keeping the joint up in the air is because otherwise I melt it. As the solder runs, I bring the joint down and lift away and release it. I'm going to pick that up and check that for how straight that is. Yeah, I'm happy with that. That's nice and straight. If it's not straight, you've got the problem of having to move it, and that'll require you putting your tweezers over the joint to protect it from the heat and then move it at the last minute. Now, if you're not confident in doing this, you can actually do this with your cross-lock tweezers, and you can hold the joint in your cross-locks. I'll just heat this up a little bit, get it off the mat. So you could set up a couple of blocks of old fire brick, and you could probably got too many blocks of fire brick there. Just the one would do. Drop that down. And I could adjust the fire brick so that the tweezers are holding the binding wire in the cross locks. So I've got both hands free, because obviously I was soldering with two hands. So it's all about confidence. If you're not confident in using your right hand to drop the joint down when you're soldering, use your cross locks. But again, the cross locks are holding the binding wire. They're not holding the joint. And that's really important. People forget that silver has no real integrity when it's hot. And what does that mean? Well, integrity means it's a technical expression. We hope we've all got integrity, don't we, Peter?
Indeed.
But integrity in silver, when you get silver hot, if you're holding it in tweezers or your cross locks, I often see people do this. They hold rings in their cross lock tweezers. The silver simply gets way too soft under the heat and it will crush everything. So if you hold that joint in the cross locks while you're soldering, you will crush the joint. There'll be nothing left of it. You'll never be able to use it. So the binding wire is such a fantastic way of controlling the heat, keeping it off the object, but it also gives you the capacity to move it around and adjust it and to hold it without anything getting cooked or squashed or burnt or wrecked. So a lot of people think binding wire is old school, but they just don't realise what a great friend it is. You know, a roll of this stuff, a few rolls of this will save you thousands of hours of pain, I can assure you. It's such a simple, old-fashioned, basic technique, but it works beautifully. Okay, that goes into the pickle. That's soldered on. And because I did my homework, I prepared one earlier. So this is the one I showed you before, which has got the joint on it. So I have that joint's just a U shape with a 1.5 millimeter hole going through the center of it. And this is where my little bought finding is going to go into. Sits up through there, sits in that little joint beautifully. And now I've got to put a rivet through there. So what I do after I've soldered is I'll get my parallels and I gently squeeze the joint to fit perfectly to the finding. And that now happens. I can let go of it. It shouldn't quite drop out, but it sits quite nicely in that U shape without the pin going through. All right. So now, because I'm going to just do a little bit of quick riveting, I'm going to get a ball burr about 2.5 mil, and I place that with my fingers into the hole on the outside of that hole and twist it and create a very small chamfered edge. Turn it around, put it into the hole, twist it, and create a little chamfer. And that's going to help me when my rivet closes up to fill the chamfer. Place my finding back in. Squeeze that in. Went in easily before, now it doesn't. There we go. And I have prepared some wire. I've got some 1.5 millimeter wire, which is fully annealed because it's going to be a rivet. And I flattened the end off. And I now place that into the joint, pushing it, twisting it through, and it's now come all the way through. So that allows that piece to turn fully. And I now have to just rivet that carefully closed. So your rivet, you probably want to come through around about 1 millimeter through the opening. I'm going to twist this spring-loaded mechanism up into the vertical position. And I'm now going to cut off my rivet on the other side, cut the remaining wire away. So I'm just going to get my end cutters, about 3/4 of a mil up to 1 millimeter extension. Give that a squeeze. There it goes. Re-straighten the pin. And I've now got my rivet wire in there. It's just a very small amount sticking out either side. And I'm now going to go onto that with my parallel pliers, making sure that the rivet's equal either side. And that's just holding on there either side of that pin. And I'm going to squeeze that by hand. Really good squeeze. And it's squeezing the excess wire down into the joint. Good squeeze. Perfect. That's done. So that piece is expertly riveted. It's still allowing the joint to move. So I've got full movement on that rivet, and that's not going to come out of there, and that's going to last a lifetime. You could
Fraser
actually
will be very happy.
Yeah, I mean, I've done that so many times, but it just works beautifully. If you get all of the soldering done properly, the placement done properly, you prepare your wire, squeeze the wire out, make that little divot. I've now got an earring. I've got a cuff link which just needs to be polished. That'll probably go into a tumbler, and that'll be finished in no time now. So there's your cuff link done.
Well done.
So,
and we've got a comment from Donna who said there's nothing wrong with old school, Chris. So.
Nothing wrong with old school.
Yeah.
And like I say, binding wire is incredible. It's again something I never learned when I was at RMIT. People turned their noses up at it, and I learned it from good people like Graham Kellett and others, Ken Gray. Yeah, the things you pick up in life are fantastic, and if you utilise them, they'll come to your advantage. So I've got just enough time to do a brooch. So again, I've got a flat piece of metal, which is it's a prefect's badge actually. So it's a little badge with a name on the front of it. It's for Clyde House, and on the back I'm going to put my joint and roller catch. I've also quality marked this at the back, so I've done all the work in pre-preparation down to a 600 grit emery. And because it's a brooch that has to go onto a lapel, usually onto your left shoulder, you have to think about where your findings go so that the brooch pin technically works. So under normal circumstances, the pin goes from your body out to your shoulder. So the pin, when it goes onto the back of the brooch, is going to be pointing that way, if that makes sense. So that means my roller catch has to be on the body side, the joint, which is the lever part, has to be on the body side, and the roller catch, which is the catching bit, has to be on the outside of the body. So my joint has to be on the right-hand side, the roller catch has to be on the left-hand side, because there are two findings going onto the one piece. And again, they are tiny. These are tiny little, 2.5 millimeter objects, which again, if you held them in your tweezers to solder them on, you would crush them. And not only that, you can end up with solder in your findings. They just won't work properly. So I set these up by positioning exactly where I want to place my solder, and there are a few little tricks in doing that. I use my trusty dividers, and I mark a line along the back of the brooch and down either side until I get a little intersection. And I'll mark that with the texter so you can see it. Done that. And I mark exactly where I want my fittings to go, because this is precision soldering. This is not rough stuff. This is all within 0.1 or 0.2 of a millimeter. It has to be, because in a brooch pin, if the joint is in a certain direction, there's no good having your catch over here. It has to be in line with the pin. When it comes in, it has to go into your catch. So you've got to be absolutely precise with this. So I've now marked where I'm going to solder these, and I'm going to mark them now with the scribe so that I've got a cross mark. When this gets hot, I'll see exactly the little cross in the metal when the flux runs where I've got to place my solder, because the little black texture line is going to burn off. So I put a little X in there. X marks the spot. Scratch it in, just a small scratch, because I don't want to scratch the back of the brooch. And a small scratch where the roller catch goes on. Nice little scratch, nice bright mark with your scribe. And I can put that into position ready to solder. I just need to do one more binding wire through my roller catch. I've done the joint already. So I close up the roller catch, put that through the opening where the pin would go, through it goes. And I'm going to tighten this up in a second. And what I want to do is when I tighten and twist this wire up, I want the tightened wire to fit between the bunny ears of the catch if I can. So I've got the little bunny ears, if anyone knows what I'm talking about with the roller catch. They're the little bits that your fingernail goes onto to turn the roller catch. I'm going to twist that wire down carefully. Yep, and right between the little bunny ears on the catch. And that keeps them out of the way. So they're not going to get soldered into position. Perfect. So I've now got my roller catch hanging off my binding wire. Remember, the binding wire is your friend. It's going to insulate you from crushing your catch.
So Sue's already indicated she's gone online to ajsonline.com and ordered some binding wire. So
yeah, no, get some nice 20 gauge, 16 gauge, 22 gauge. You'll never look back. Again, I'm going to just emery the very base of that roller catch. When you get a chance, when you do this, have a good look at your fittings. You'll see some incredible, the things I just can't show you on camera because they're so fine. If you look at a quality roller catch, you'll look at the bottom and you'll see this big groove going down the bottom of the catch at the back, at the very bottom when you're going to solder it. And if you look at your joint, you'll see all these little dimples on the bottom of the joint. Looks like someone's, hammered it away. They've been specially put there by the manufacturer so that when your solder runs, it either runs into the groove of that roller catch or it runs into the dimples of your joint. Now you have to appreciate that your findings are under huge stress. When you actually put a little catch into position, you're putting a lot of stress on those findings, flicking them up and back, and they're only tiny little things. And so the integrity of your solder is important. It's important that the solder go into those grooves and fully bonds them down to your bottom plate. So enough talking, let's get this on. Got just enough time. I'm now going to boracic my brooch. Trying to set fire to the workshop here. Keep it nice and clean. I'm sure everyone thinks I work in silver, Peter. Only, but I do work in gold. So yeah, when you do a lot of commercial work, it's usually in silver. So you've got to get good at working with silver. And it's such a beautiful metal to work with because you then have to understand how heat transfers, because silver is such a good conductor of heat. It's very quick. Right, so I select the right size. Remember, if you're not confident, you can always put your fittings into the cross locks and sit your cross locks down into position so that you just go in and solder. But I'm very confident just to hold the binding wire. So I'm going to put the joint on first. Let's see, that's my roller catch. Get that out of the way. There's my joint. And obviously they have to line up, and that's why I've gone to so much trouble to put the marks on the back of the plate. Oops, just knocked my camera there. Just changing my soldering position so I can see what I'm doing here.
That's right. We felt the earth move, Chris.
You good to go?
Yep.
So I'm now heating the plate and I'm applying the flux to my brooch back. A little bit there, a little bit there. I turn my brush around. Still got plenty of flux on it. Heat up my plate, and I'm now going to place my solder there. So it's important that you use the right amount of solder. That takes a little bit of practice. Too much solder and you'll run into your roller catch, and too little solder and you won't have a good join. I'm going to join these two little bits of solder together. Perfect. Heat the plate up gently. That's the bit for my roller catch. It's a little bit smaller. That's a bit for my joint. And I put those right in position where the little scratch marks are. Pick up my joint. Remember to put it on in the right direction. Heat the joint, touch the flux brush. Heat the joint, touch the flux brush. Now I've got flux just on the bottom of the joint, which is what I'm after. Just going to sit that down, position that properly in my pliers so I can see what I'm doing. Turn it a bit more. If I do it this way, you might be able to see a bit better. That's probably a bit better. And I hover above where I'm going to sit it down. And just see I'm just elevated by about 8 or 10 mils. Heat the back of my brooch up. And when the solder runs, it's almost about to run. Place the joint down and release. Let's have a look and see if that's straight. Oh, excellent. That's one done. That was quick.
Beautiful.
So just hold your breath, line everything up properly. I'm just going to adjust that in my fingers while it's cold. And this is where it's very important just to apply flux to the very bottom of your roller catch. If you apply too much flux, so I heat the roller catch gently, a couple of swishes, just enough to darken it up, and just enough flux to go on the bottom of the roller catch. Otherwise, it will run up into the catch. And by blackening the catch, you can probably see how dark that is now. It's quite dark, but there is flux on the bottom. The bottom is clean, the top is dirty. And that's what's going to keep the solder from running into my roller catch and ruining it. Got to be careful I don't burn myself here. Just turn this so you can see what's happening. Okay, here I go. So I reheat my plate. Again, use your cross locks if you're not confident. Heating the plate. Flux is running. I'm hovering above the solder. Solder dropped. Bring my roller catch down and release. And you'll find that solder will run up immediately into the roller catch if you get your heat right. I'm a little bit out of alignment, so I'm going to just very gently straighten this. So I move the heat further away from the catch. Just going to use my tweezers to adjust. Lovely. And now I've got great alignment. Just going to cool that off, and we'll try and show you that alignment while Peter's got me on the soldering mat. So I've now got my two pieces that will line up because my pin has to go between the two. So there's the pin, and that pin has to go from the joint at the back here, and it has to roll forward into the roller catch at the front. So I'm going to cut off the binding wire, place them in the pickle, and then I'm ready to put my pin on. And that's what you have to remember about your binding wire, is to take it off before it goes in the pickle. So your pickle doesn't go pink. That's the front one off. And the back one snipped. Just use your end cutters, it'll snip off. Yeah, and I'm really, really happy with that. They're lined up. Joint at the back, roller catch at the front, and there's my front. This is my back area. And it's important that I pickle it now and try to make sure that my little bunny ears and my roller catch are still working, which is what would happen if you do it properly. If you overheat your catch, you'll fuse it all together and it won't work. So we'll get it out of there and we'll make sure it's fused properly. It's soldered properly without fusing it.
Oh, Chris, Orietta's asked, did you pre-twist the pin?
No, well, the pin, sometimes I do. This one's actually a bought one, so I'm actually using bought fittings at the moment. Yeah, and I often put the nickel pin on things. I actually buy the nickel ones. Probably, yeah. Normally, when I work in sterling silver, everything is sterling silver. But I find it's a good question, because it's quite hard to hand make silver pins and to tension by twisting them. If it was an expensive 18 karat gold piece, that's what I would do. But with a production piece worth about $60, I'm not going to hand turn pins, no. So I prefer to buy the nickel ones. You can buy nickel silver ones, which are white brass. They're stronger. Fair
enough. Horses for courses.
Yeah, you can buy sterling silver ones, and I've always been disappointed because you pay a lot for them, and they just bend because they're soft. And it is a really good question. And I find in jewellery, that's part of that challenge in jewellery, is to make sure it's economically viable. You know, do a great job, but make it viable. But you certainly can. You can harden your pins by twisting them. So I'm now going to just test the little bunny ears on this catch. Sometimes they freeze up a little bit because they've taken a lot of heat. So this catch doesn't want to move at the moment. It might need to go in the pickle a little bit longer. There it goes. I can just hear it click. Now it's moving. So you just got to take your time. You've got to be very gentle with these things after you've soldered them. Yeah, it's rolling. And I don't overwork them. I just want to get it together. I've rolled that forward, and that just needs a bit more pickling, because you need to free up the catch and make sure the little bunny ears are moving front to back. So it's sort of run out of time. I'm just going to roll that back and show you while Pete's got the camera on me. I'm going to put the pin in without the rivet and just show you that locks in there. It's nice and straight. It's a bit long. I'm going to have to cut it off. That's okay. And there's that pin in position. Roller catch, the joint end. This is the roller catch end. And with that into position, I would just cut that off. Make sure it's sticking out about 2 mil or so, 2.5 mil out the end of the catch. Just cut that end off. And I would resharpen that end now. So that's short enough. 2 mils out the end. Turn it a bit. You can just see the ends coming out. I would resharpen that end up a little bit, and then I'd put the pin through, and then that would be ready to defire, scale, or polish.
Thanks very much, and we'll look forward to seeing you another time soon.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your day. Look forward to seeing you next time.
Okay. Bye, Chris.
Bye.